All right, Alexander. So we had Emmanuel Macron speaking with French President Macron speaking with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And of course, they're going to be talking about the imminent invasion of Ukraine. Imminent. It's happening any day now, according to Jen Psaki and Joe Biden. But Zelensky thinks otherwise, the Ukraine president. Anyway, okay, Macron and Putin, they spoke. We also had the UN Security Council.
Yeah.
And, for all the talk that Russia is without friends and isolated, boy, you don't get that impression when you saw that UN Security Council meeting or read the transcripts. No doubt China has Russia's back. The other members of the Security Council, they're like, no war. We're not going to go to war, everybody. Calm down. We don't want any of this. And Russia also hit back very, very hard at the United States. Actually, I think the Russian ambassador watches our channel because we did a video where we said, how come no one just doesn't ask the United States for the receipts? Show us the satellite imagery. Show us everything about what's going on the border. Show us the tanks. Show us the movements. Because the U.S. has not shown anybody this.
Yes.
The Russian ambassador brought it up. He says, show us.
Absolutely.
Give us the receipts that we're about to invade Ukraine. Anyway, two big events taking place.
Two big events. Well, one is real, one is theatre. But let's deal with the real one first, which is that Macron spoke to Putin on Friday, and we've had a detailed Russian readout about that one. But I did a program about that discussion between Macron and Putin, which you can find on our Locals channel, and in which I said that the Russian readout was very, very interesting because it seemed to hint that some kind of negotiation between the French and the Russians was about to start taking place, obviously to some extent about Ukraine, but also about European security matters. Now, on the next working day, which is Monday, there is a follow-up conversation between Putin and Macron. And it's very interesting how that conversation took place because, of course, Putin allocates slots over the course of his day to speak to foreign leaders. And the slot that he had allocated on Monday was to talk to Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson wasn't able to make the call because he had political problems, which we've discussed in another video. So, sure enough, what then happened was that the caller, the person that Putin spoke to over the course of this slot, was Macron. In other words, they arranged, the French and the Russians hurriedly arranged another conversation directly after the previous conversation that they had with each other, using a slot which had been a time slot which had previously been allocated to the British Prime Minister. Now, the Kremlin has provided a readout of this second conversation, but it is completely uninformative. It simply says that it was a follow-up to the conversation they had on Friday. Now, all of this clearly points to an actual negotiation of some kind being underway. It's clear that Putin and Macron, the French and the Russians, are now talking serious business with each other. Now, to be very clear, that may not lead anywhere. We don't know what's going to come of all of this, but Macron spoke to the European Parliament some weeks ago about the need for Europe, for France, to initiate a parallel negotiation with the Russians to the one that the Americans were undertaking, and it now looks as if that parallel negotiation process is underway. Now, we don't know where that's going. We don't know how that's going to end. Note that it is a negotiation, a direct negotiation involving the French and Russian presidents, but it looks serious and it looks real. As I said, I'm not going to predict the outcome. I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but there was that meeting in Paris last week, bringing together the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Germans and the French. There's going to be a follow-up meeting with those 4 parties in Berlin in about 10 days' time. And it looks as if something is now starting to happen.
Yeah. So Macron wants a big foreign policy win before the elections.
Absolutely, absolutely correct. That's exactly what he's doing. And apparently he's finding in Putin a receptive speaker. Putin was not prepared to assign a second time slot to Johnson yesterday. He didn't want to talk to Johnson yesterday. He wanted to talk to Macron instead. So that strongly suggests that whatever Macron is telling the Russians are interested in. And that could point to some real breakthrough in the negotiations over the next few weeks. Now, I don't want to run ahead of ourselves. Obviously, the problems are enormous. It's not guaranteed, but something serious is happening. And obviously, the fact that the elections are coming in France concentrates the minds amongst the French wonderfully.
Before you get to the the Security Council meeting, what exactly would they be negotiating? I mean, the Russians are saying, "Forget Ukraine. This is about security guarantees in NATO."
Yes.
And the U.S. and the U.K.
Yes.
They're pushing this,
Yes.
fictitious Russian invasion. What
Yeah.
what exactly would Putin and Macron be negotiating? And you have the Minsk agreements, which the
Exactly.
Ukraine to this day has not abided by.
Exactly. Now, I think you've now put your finger on it because, of course, the Russians are not prepared to talk about Ukraine with the Americans. They probably are willing to talk about Ukraine with the French because the French, alongside the Germans, were the joint mediators of the Minsk agreement. And they are also the people who are supposed to supervise, alongside the Russians and the Germans, in this Normandy 4 grouping, the direct negotiations between the Ukrainian parties that are supposed to implement the Minsk agreement. So it's quite likely that the Russians and the French are now talking about how to get the Minsk agreement unblocked to work towards a settlement of Ukraine, that in Ukraine. That is a real possibility, and it could be that's one part of it. But what was very interesting about the previous the earlier readout, the Russians provided of the talks on Friday, is that apparently the Russians say that Macron briefed them in detail about ideas Macron has for ensuring pan-European security. Now, that looks very close to something like the kind of security guarantees that the Russians are looking for. So Anatol Lieven, this brilliant British commentator who writes about European affairs, he said that one possible way to diffuse this crisis over Ukraine, over NATO's eastward expansion, would be for Macron to come along and say that he is opposed to Ukraine's entering NATO, and he expects that all forthcoming French presidents would be as well. Now, that would not provide the Russians fully with those legally binding security guarantees that they're seeking, but it would take the issue of Ukraine's membership of NATO off the table, and it would allow political space for further discussions. And it is something that Macron has it in his power to do. So it could be that we're heading towards something like that, a parallel, a two-track process, one in which the Russians and the French work together to get the Minsk agreement implemented, and a parallel track where the French move towards reassuring the Russians with some kind of public commitment from France that France will oppose for the time being, well, for the foreseeable future, Ukraine joining NATO. Remember, France does have a veto over Ukraine joining NATO because France has a veto over which countries are admitted to NATO. So it could be something like that is in the works.
Yeah, boy, Nuland and Blinken and the neocons are not going to be happy with France, and they've completely cut the U.S. out of all of this. Very interesting development.
Well, indeed. I mean, if something like this happens, the neocons are going to be absolutely incandescent. The cries of betrayal that are going to pour out of London and Washington are going to be a wonder to behold. But again, of course, bear something in mind. It's also, and these things are not to be discounted, revenge on the part of the French for the AUKUS deal, which I mean they were cut out of all those discussions. Those discussions were kept secret. The French have been incredibly angry about that. Macron has been took it personally extremely badly. So this would be a wonderful opportunity for revenge over that. So not to be discounted, not to be overlooked, and something that would play very well in France, by the way.
And who will they regime change Macron with? Le Pen? Zemmour?
Well, exactly. Zemmour.
You know?
Well, exactly. Pécresse has basically imploded. Is imploding, so she's not really an option. And to be straightforward about it, if Macron comes up with a deal like this, it will be supported in France. I mean, the French will support it. So, I mean, you know, a regime change operation looks incredibly difficult. He will win re-election. I mean, he would win re-election, I am sure, and it would be supported. All the problems with Macron, domestic problems that we've talked about at immense length, of course, they would remain. But the challenge would come from the right, not from the left, and the right would endorse this deal that he's done with Putin, if he does do it.
All right, Security Council meeting.
Right, well, okay, so that's
thoughts?
the real negotiations, as I said, the real other ones. And then we have this utterly bizarre Security Council meeting. Now, again, we've said this many times, this is the worst foreign policy team that the United States has ever had. Why they cooked up this Security Council meeting is incredibly difficult to understand because, of course, there's no Russian invasion. There's nothing like that going on. So the meeting took place. We had, you know, loyal but very tepid words of support from some of the US's NATO allies. The French comments were extremely tepid, in my opinion. But then what came out was, firstly, the Russian ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia, made a very strong speech. He made the point there's no actual Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's no Russian plan to invade Ukraine. The only people who are talking about a war are the Americans. We Russians are not talking about a war. So what is all this nonsense? And he also made a point, by the way, which we've made, I don't think anybody else has, that all this talk about hundreds of thousands of Russian troops on the border, where's the corroboration for this? Exactly the point you were making. Where are the photos? Where is the evidence that these troops are even there? And that, of course, took the entire wind out of the sails of the Americans and the British who were pushing this. And then you've got comments from a whole lot of ambassadors of other countries, and from India, from Mexico, from Brazil, from some of the African states, and all of them were basically saying, what is this issue? Why are we even here? What are we talking about? The Kenyan ambassador actually voted against having the meeting because he said he couldn't really understand what was even the topic of the discussion. There is no threat to Ukraine. You know, there should be peace. The Minsk agreement, every single ambassador said the Minsk agreement needs to be fully implemented. But there was no criticism of the Russians from any one of these ambassadors. All of the ambassadors of all the non-NATO states, basically, their sympathies were more with Moscow than they were with Washington, because ultimately, as I said, there were no objective criticisms that could be made. As I said, the Russians have troops within their own country. They've issued no threats against Ukraine. So what is the purpose of this whole discussion? It was a debacle. I don't understand what Blinken and his team thought they were doing, and Liz Truss as well, thought they were doing, but they gained absolutely nothing out of this Security Council meeting. As I said, the Chinese supported the Russians, and all of the other big states, the big powers, India, Brazil, Mexico, and the rest, the African states, well, they didn't so much stand on the fence, they leaned towards the Russian side over the course of the discussion. So instead of the US looking like it's united the world community against Russia, the impression given was the exact opposite.
Yeah. No one wants this.
No.
Russia doesn't want it.
No.
No one even in NATO wants this, except for, I mean, the countries that want this literally are the US, the UK. I mean, am I missing someone?
No, well, I mean, Canada, Australia, I suppose, to some extent.
Canada, yeah.
The Australia, the Five Eyes, but not, well, I should say the Four Eyes, because it's not clear that New Zealand is at all signed up to this either, to be straightforward.
I don't think New Zealand wants this either.
No, at all, exactly. And as Nebenzia very cleverly said, that's the Russian ambassador, Ukraine doesn't want this. I mean, the Ukrainians are saying, we're not under threat of attack. So if Ukraine doesn't feel threatened, who are the Americans and the British to tell it that it is being threatened? I mean, the whole thing had a very surreal quality, and it was a very weird debate. By the way, Nebenzia is, to be straightforward about it, not just a heavyweight, but he's what the British like to call a bruiser. He's not somebody that you really want to come up against unless you're, really strong and know how to come across, effectively. And in my opinion, he just wiped the floor.
Yeah, it was something to see. Anyway, boy, they're really desperate. The Biden administration, they're really desperate.
I presume,
and Zelensky is saying our economy is tanking. By the way, he continues to say, "Stop, our economy is
tanking." Exactly. I presume this idea of having the Security Council meeting was to keep this idea that there is some kind of crisis on the boil. But as I said, if it is being kept on the boil, the people who are being burnt are the Ukrainians, because it's their economy that's tanking. And I mean, it's the whole thing is very, very surreal. I mean, the Indian ambassador's comments, the Mexican ambassador's comments, the Brazilian ambassador's comments. Remember, this is the Brazil that's being led by Bolsonaro, who is supposed to be a friend of the US, but none of them gave any support to the US position at all. It was a wonder to behold, a massive own goal, a very peculiar decision to hold a meeting in this way.
Yeah, they're desperate to keep this in the news cycle.
Oh, no.
Exactly. And I think the Biden White House has one calculation correct, and that is that they know the mainstream media and the CNNs, they'll present the Security Council meeting as some sort of, diplomatic win for Blinken and his team. The Biden Blinken, White House, go to the Security Council to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine, something. And the UK comes out in support of democracy and freedom, because the narrative, Alexander, is that the US has to go to war with Russia over Ukraine because it's about going to war for democracy.
Yes, I know.
This is coming from the Biden White House, by the way.
Well, I know. Absolutely.
81 million votes, of course.
Of course. I mean, and of course, it's very true. 81 million votes. But I mean, what makes it even more farcical is, of course, they're talking about going to war to defend democracy and about we can't have another Munich agreement. I mean, who's even talking about that? Who's even floating those issues? Who's talking about spheres of influence? I mean, this is all Americans talking about these things. But anyway, they're talking in this melodramatic fashion about this. But when it comes down to, are you prepared to send troops to Ukraine to defend Ukraine? The answer is no. So clearly, we're not quite as threatened. Democracy isn't in quite as much danger. This isn't the epically existential issue that we talk about. I mean, the narrative has got completely out of control. It's detached itself totally from the facts. And yes, you can play this thing on, the columns of the Washington Post or MSNBC, and talking points on MSNBC. That even there, they're beginning to struggle. I mean, we had all that chaos last week with the CNN report about the Biden-Zelensky call. But even there, they're struggling. But, you can just about pull it off there. But when it comes to a discussion of the Security Council, it just falls apart. Because governments around the world, Brazilian, Mexican, Indian, and of course, other countries, Gabon, Kenya. Kenya was really an ally of the US, remember? A friend of the US, the UAE. They're all utterly bewildered and skeptical about why they've been called together at all.
Yep.
To discuss
Because they all know, because they all know that there are no troops on the border
Absolutely.
between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah,
It's simple.
as the Mexican ambassador pointed out, the Russians have said, by themselves, they're not going to invade Ukraine. So, I mean, given that they've said that, where's the issue? What's the discussion? What's the talking point here? I mean, what is?
Zelensky says they're not going to invade Ukraine.
Well, exactly. So, why were they even meeting? I mean, 10 countries voted for this meeting because you'll always find countries that will agree to have a meeting because they don't want to annoy the Americans by simply refusing to have a meeting. That would have been a debacle if most countries had refused. So they go along with the meeting, but their skepticism at the meeting was absolutely plain and obvious. And to be straightforward about it, I think from the Russian point of view, it was actually better that this meeting took place because it showed exactly the point that you made at the start, which is far from the Russians being isolated on this issue. It is the Americans who are.
All right. Let's hope this play ends. Let's hope we get the curtains drawn for this play. And we can move on.
Absolutely.
Anyway, all right. The Duran.locals.com. Check us out there, everybody. And Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, and Super U is where you'll find us. And good day. That's the mug. And that is the code. 10% off all merch on the Duran shop. Take care.